from Microbe TV, this is TWiP, This Week in Parasitism, episode 235, recorded on May 3rd, 2024. Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast all about parasites. Joining me today from Fort Lee, New Jersey, Dixon Despommier.
As Daniel would say, hello, everybody.
Well, what is it that you say, Dixon?
What I say is what he says. He's the boss. He's absolutely the boss. I'm looking out my window, and it looks like a brilliant day. It has been so far. The temperature has been humane, in the high 40s, early 50s, and but unfortunately, or maybe not, according to Dr. Griffin. Of course, there should always be a breeze with this, so you can go sailing. And indeed, my wife, as we speak, is sailing along the western coast of Turkey.
Oh, nice.
She's heading back up to Istanbul, having just visited Ephesus. And she's raving about it constantly. And, it's a little bit, try the dark meat.
Also joining us from New York, Daniel Griffin.
Hello, everyone.
He said generically.
And from Glasgow, Scotland, Christina Naula.
Hello, everyone. I thought I'd copy that. It sounds nice.
It's appropriate. In the TWiP we just did, there was an echo virus, so that's the way that should work.
Oh, wow. Out. Well, I'm jealous, Dixon, to hear about your wife out there sailing.
It was a two-masted schooner. She showed me pictures of it.
That's nice.
It was quite lovely. Lots of amenities above and below deck. But the other night they hit rough seas.
Did she have the till?
No, she wouldn't. No. She didn't go near the cash register or the aft part of the boat.
The till is not the cash register.
I get the joke. So the tiller, was she at the helm? Was she helming the ship?
She she got seasick because it was so rough.
Wow.
And she gave her lunch back to the place where it came from, unfortunately.
What's the length of the boat, Dixon?
I would, if I had to guess, it's well over 40 feet. It's a large ship.
Probably 100 feet if you've got a schooner.
It's quite large.
Yeah. And a schooner, you say 12
people on board.
In a lot of ways what defines. So what is a schooner? If people see a two-masted ship out there, the aft mast is taller than the forward mast, right? That would be your schooners, which,
I see.
For a little bit of history, they were invented by American fishermen to get their fish back to market to sell as quick as possible. And so that's sort of the history of the America's Cup. Now, this sort of replaced some of the earlier ships. But if you see another two-masted ship where the aft mast is just a little bit lower, that might be a ketch. And much smaller and aft of the helm would be your yawl.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, just
what about a sloop?
Great
is
terminology.
A sloop falling into that category
a sloop
also?
is a single mast, yeah. A single mast with the Jonathan sloop triangular,
wow.
Are there many different kinds of sailboats?
There really are. I mean, there's many more than I would be able to name offhand. So, frigates.
And off we go this week in sailing.
We need a this week in sailing. And
the only one that I can think of is ketch. What's a ketch?
So the ketch is much like a schooner, except that aft mast is smaller, and there's a certain angle between the two, and that aft mast is forward of the helm.
And what is the ones that came over from Spain to the New World? What were those
Spanish
called?
Galleons.
The galleons, right?
Yeah. So you had this was back in the days of the square riggers, right? So the mainsails, rather than being this sloop or even the gaff rig sloop where it kind of goes up a little before coming down, they were square sails, and they in general would just sail downwind. Now, there is a way, interesting enough, you can actually get a square-rigged boat, particularly with some of these forward sails, to actually get above a beam reach. So you actually start sailing into the wind, which is sort of the excitement of modern sailing, the sailing into the apparent wind and creating a wind speed faster than that which is blowing by moving into it.
That's pretty tacky stuff, though, don't you think?
Oh, I like that.
Do people still use square rigs, Daniel? Or
there still are some out there. I mean, they're spectacular, beautiful boats when you see those out there.
Yeah. Cool. It's very cool.
And what kind of boat do you have?
I have a sloop.
You do have a sloop.
Yes.
Okay.
Sloop doggy dog. Is that how it goes?
That's right. Sloop doggy.
Kind of like that. Yeah.
Right.
Someone has named their sloop that, I'm sure.
Sure.
All right. Back to the items of business, which is parasites. It's time for clinical case. Today is a clinical case solving, folks. So Daniel, can you tell us what we're working with?
Certainly. So let me remind everyone tuning back in and acquaint those who are tuning in for the first time with our case from last month, from TWiP 233. And the story here was I was recently asked about this case while I was off visiting Denmark, and where I was sailing, which was great in the sea there. But so the story is this man in his 50s has been reporting months of abdominal discomfort and decides to go discuss this situation with a local pharmacist. He describes this discomfort, some nausea, some bloating. The pharmacist recommends that he takes some mebendazole. He takes the mebendazole, and sometime afterwards, he vomits this worm in the sink. And I actually get to see this worm. The worm does not have any obvious segmentation. So it appears completely non-segmented. It's moving about. I can see a video of this. One end is very pointy. The other a bit less so. I do get a little bit more information about, so where did this happen and where was this gentleman? Do you guys remember, did we share that last time? But I guess as we go through the emails, that was, I felt quite relevant. Where is this gentleman? Where did he go and get mebendazole, which might actually be a hint? Where is mebendazole given out by pharmacists? So.
All right.
Mexico.
We had quite a few guesses this time, so let's start with you, Dixon.
Okie doke. Marcus writes, "Hi, TWiP. I'm writing from the University of Washington, Seattle, after recently hearing about this podcast from my professor, Dr. Drew Bell, in my Micro M460 class. Although we haven't covered helminths extensively in class yet, I still thought I would take a stab at this week's case. I believe the parasitic worm described in the provided case is Ascaris lumbricoides. Given the unsegmented nature of the worm as well, description of being pointy at one end but not the other, I began to narrow down my identification to the nematodes. The large size of the worm eliminated my suspicion of pinworms or hookworms, or the lack of more severe symptoms beyond abdominal discomfort, bloating, and nausea indicated the possibility of ascariasis. This aligns with the pharmacist's recommendation of mebendazole, as well as the patient's location in India. I really enjoyed listening to this week's episode, and I'm looking forward to the reveal in the next one. Best regards, Marcus."
Christina.
Charles writes, "Hello, we are the Parasitology geeks of McGill campus." Ooh. I'm not going to try. First year medical student.
Utaway.
Okay, I should be able to do that. I can speak French, but that's, yeah. Okay, my apologies for butchering your campus name. Our answer is Ascaris lumbricoides for the clinical case from the podcast on April 19th. Hope we win. Charles Chervet, BSc, and he's a first-year medical student at McGill.
Daniel.
Well, just to let them know, all you have to do is to be in it to win it, right?
That's right.
That's the only requirement. You don't have to get it right. Just be in it to win it. Okay, Rodolfo writes, "Dear TWiPers, greetings from Brazil. The patient in question is very likely infected by Ascaris lumbricoides. 3 facts must be taken into account here. 1, the symptomatology with a persistent abdominal discomfort along with nausea and bloating, which, nonspecific as it is, could be caused by a parasitic disease. The use of mebendazole, an anti-helminthic broad-spectrum drug, but mainly used to treat nematode infections. The vomited worm and its morphology, that leads us to think about a macroscopic parasite and to discard cestodes and flukes. Among the nematodes the mebendazole treats, the biggest in size is the Ascaris, and the description given leads me to believe it is a male. Though they live in the duodenum of their hosts, these worms can be regurgitated during an emetic episode. Any bolus of adults might explain the abdominal discomfort, and an old paper from 1917, to be precise, showed that Ascaris suum can survive more than 10 days outside the host's body. Our patient should seek medical help, as killing the worms of a possible bolus could worsen his clinical condition and even lead to an intestinal obstruction. To confirm this diagnostic hypothesis, an abdominal physical examination is in order to seek any abdominal masses, signs of peritonitis, or organ-specific affections, and ascites. Also, one should ask for a stool examination and an ultrasound of the pancreatic and biliary ducts in order to investigate eventual hepatobiliary ascariasis. If this diagnosis is confirmed or not discarded, an ERCP could be performed. Thank you very much for this great program.
Krista writes, "Hi, TWiP hosts. I just finished listening to this episode. While getting ready for work, I often listen on my commute to campus. I did a quick search for mebendazole, and the first result was pinworms. However, the size of the worm doesn't fit that, and the symptoms weren't well aligned either. Mayo Clinic says this can also be used to treat whipworms, hookworms, and Ascaris lumbricoides. A quick search confirmed that the size and symptoms of A. lumbricoides fit, and that is an extremely common infection in many parts of the world, including India, so that's my guess. I teach introductory microbiology, and I'm planning to incorporate more case studies next semester. TWiP is such an excellent resource. Thanks for providing these." Krista is at Pima Community College in Tucson, Arizona. Back to you, Dixon.
Okie dokie, here I go. You want me to take the next two, or I can take the next one? That's fine with
You
me.
can take two, Dixon.
Thank you. Take two and see me in the morning, did you say? Tomas writes, 7 inches. That's an angry giant intestinal worm. A common name for Ascaris lumbricoides.
Yes.
Jay writes, "Dear Twipsters, I am loving your podcast. I also have fun writing in, which I began doing a few months ago, but I'm a bit self-conscious of the perhaps extensive length of my recent submissions. So in an attempt to keep this one brief, I wrote a haiku. Mebendazole roused the nematode from its lair. The suffering host hurls." Perhaps this haiku would have been appreciated by Simensu Koino, intentionally infected himself and his younger brother with Ascaris suum and Ascaris lumbricoides in the 1920s. I suspect this man had Ascaris lumbricoides, which is very common in India. Prevalence there is estimated to be close to 20% of the population, or about 150 million people. Keep hurling out your great work, Jay. And he's a medical officer. I like that. At the Olympic Medical Clinic in Los Angeles.
Christina.
Michelle and Alexander from the First Vienna Parasitology Passion Club write, "Dear Lumbricuties, the case presentation, or rather the size and shape of the worm, is typical for ascariasis. Just this week, we received a patient from the surgical department with inflammation of the gallbladder and a large number of worms visible in the gallbladder on MRI and ultrasound. While the morphology was also typical for ascariasis, the surgeons doubted the diagnosis because the patient had been living in Austria for more than 30 years and denied traveling outside of Europe. Of course, Sherlock Holmes teaches us that eliminating the impossible and leaving the improbable must lead us to truth. It is obvious that there is a bias at work here. Ascariasis is prevalent in many countries in Eastern and Southern Europe, But parasitic infections are often seen as diseases of poverty, of underdevelopment, of uncleanliness. In contrast, Europe as a continent is contrasted with the global south, despite the fact that poverty is prevalent and rising everywhere. We strongly recommend the article Europe's Neglected Infections of Poverty by Peter Hotez and Meredith Gerwith, which is open access, and they provide a link for that. Thank you for this great case. All the best.
Daniel.
Hey, all right. Dear Vincent, Dixon, Daniel, and Christina, greetings from Sydney and the land down under. I hope this guest arrives in time. Sometimes the podcast episode arrives late on the Apple Podcast app, leaving only a few days to submit a guest. However, this time I decided to take the chance and wait for a certain 7th edition of a certain large red book to arrive so I can be more certain about my guest. Vincent, thank you so much. The book has finally made the journey. As for the man in his 50s hearing about a large abdominal non-segmented worm, my gut reaction, pun intended, was Ascaris. After reading through the nematode section, I'm fairly confident that the man is infected by a large number of Ascaris lumbricoides. In my mind, all of Ascaris's properties match the case. Ascaris is extremely prevalent in India. Size matches being the largest nematode infecting humans, with adult worms reaching between 15 and 30 centimeters. Generalized abdominal symptoms match as well, indicating something causing obstructions in the gut. Shape matches as well, with one end being pointy and the other, I'm assuming, tapers into a twirl. Finally, mebendazole is available over the counter, being a treatment for Ascaris. It's an additional piece of evidence in favor of Ascaris. As always, I am grateful for the knowledge and perspective you share.
Dixon. Oh, wait a minute. Do I have one? Yeah, it's me. Sorry. Rafid writes, hello, TWiPers. Please forgive the brief answer, but I have been on call a lot lately, and it has been very busy, so I will keep it short. Ascaris. Ascariasis or Ascaris? That is my final answer. Cheers, and thank you again for your excellent podcast. Back to you, Dixon.
Okay, Byron writes, good afternoon, TWiP doctors. Writing from a rainy afternoon in Illinois. We had a stretch of great weather for spring, and now back to the normal April showers. Not a lot of information for this case. I sense the treatment of mebendazole could be a hint, so looked up in the parasitic diseases version with infection treatment of mebendazole. Received 7 entries. Cross-checked those entries with worm size and life cycle, he meant, I think. Found Ascaris lumbricoides offers the best match. Other parasites either are too small or do not involve a migration stage where they can be coughed up. I think this would be my guess. Waiting for the next case, and I hope this email is not too late. P.S. Thank you so much for mailing the book. I think I mentioned in my previous email that I often listen to the podcast while driving my son to his violin practice. So when I showed up the book, to my surprise, he immediately said, "Is this the book from the podcast by Vincent Racaniello that you listened to?" Good for him for paying attention. I had thought he was asleep most of the time. Thank you again for the book. This is priceless.
Dixon, did I hear you mispronounce my name?
You did, actually. Vincent Racaniello. Black and yellow.
Yeah, I just heard the mispronunciation, which surprises me because I've known you for 80 years.
You can go back in the tape and find out. But
we'll go back to the tape.
I hope you can obliterate
We'll go back later. Christina, you're next.
Okay, I'll do 2 because the next one is really short.
Right.
Felix writes, Dear hosts, I have to keep this one really short since I'm busy on vacation, relaxing at the pool. That's very lucky. Ascaris lumbricoides seems to check all the boxes in this one. I'm looking forward to some interesting differentials. And then Christian writes, Dear TWiP team, greetings from a surprisingly cold Basel. The description of this worm sounds very much like Ascaris lumbricoides, as not many non-segmented helminths grow to this size. Mebendazole would be toxic to the worm, so it is possible that it tried to flee the now toxic environment of the small bowel, where it usually resides. Similar events have been reported from people being put under anesthesia. I do not recommend to Google these pictures. I did actually, and I agree. It is also famous for causing anemia in heavily infested people and even bowel obstruction in extreme cases. The infection usually occurs by ingesting fertilized eggs from contaminated food sources, and although the eggs are very hardy, the worm itself is not, which usually a single dose of albendazole or ivermectin being enough to kill it. In this case, it is possible that the over-the-counter dose of mebendazole was not high enough, hence the worm exited the unfavorable host. All the best. Looking forward to the next case.
Daniel.
Justin writes, hello all. After looking online for India worm vomiting, I discovered an article from the Times of India about a viral video of a worm vomited up after a patient took Vermox mebendazole. The AI-generated photo the article used shows a segmented worm, but the video clearly shows a large unsegmented worm in a sink. After a brief further search, I will make a guess of Ascaris lumbricoides roundworm, as India is estimated to have 20 to 25% of all cases worldwide. All the best, Justin.
Alex writes, dear TWiP professors, hola from the Camino del Norte in northern Spain. I'm currently in the small coastal town of Luarca, where it's a sunny 15 degrees C with a light breeze. Surprisingly similar to the conditions in my hometown of Calgary, Canada, where it apparently snowed 12 centimeters just last week. I've been listening to TWiP on and off for the past few years through my undergraduate microbiology degree, and having some free time while walking has allowed me to finally catch up enough to write in with a guess. Firstly, I want to join the long line of people thanking you for all your efforts in science education. I'm deeply grateful for the invaluable information and passion you share so generously, and have, in fact, been inspired by this podcast and TWiV to apply for a research master's in Europe in the field of infectious disease. Since finishing my undergrad degree in 2023, I have been longing to contribute to the study of parasitic diseases, and I'm hoping to eventually follow in Dr. Griffin's footsteps of infectious disease medicine. I would simply not have discovered or been as passionate about the amazing world of parasites without the combination of your welcoming, patient attitudes towards new learners and vast knowledge in your respective fields. I, along with many others, truly owe a great debt to all of you. I fear I have already overstayed my welcome in my very first email, so I will resist my long-winded nature and keep it short for my guess. I believe this is an infection of Ascaris lumbricoides, indicated by the large non-segmented word symptoms and mebendazole treatment. Back to you, Dixon.
Corey writes, hi, TWiP. Greetings from OU's, I presume that's Ohio University's parasitology class. Today was a slightly windy and sunny day, with the temperatures hitting 80. This week in our class, we listened to episode 233 of the podcast. As a class, we concluded that the 50-year-old male complaining of stomach pains and nausea was infected with a parasitic hookworm, ascaris. Ascariasis, I'm sorry, I read that wrong. With the parasitic hookworm, ascariasis. This is due to the area this case was in, India, the lack of segmentation in the worm, how long the worm was, and presented the same symptoms that an ascariasis infection would give. Let me read these names too. Thank you. Corey, Alex, Abigail, Corrine, Hannah, Diavin, Mariah, David, Lance, Daniela, Adam, Lauren, Briar, Keem, Kathleen, Christina, Pate, Clara, Laura, Marcos, Tamara, Oliver, Colin, Laura, and the proctor of the course is Dr. Ayesha Prather.
So, Dixon, you read it correctly when you corrected the error.
Okay.
Because it's written the parasitic hookworm ascariasis. The ascariasis, of course, is a disease. It's the parasitic hookworm ascaris, which you read it.
And it should probably be nematode ascaris, but just we'll
hookworm.
Throw that in
Yes,
there.
but ascariasis is the disease anyway.
Well,
that's what I'm complaining about. All right, Christina.
Courtney writes, hello, TWiP team. My name is Courtney. I'm an undergraduate at California State University, Dominguez Hills, majoring in clinical laboratory sciences and minoring in microbiology. Since switching from nursing to the laboratory, I have listened to the ASM podcast for the last 5 years. I worked a graveyard shift as a laboratory technician while in school, and your podcast make the night go by quickly while streaking on agar or processing virology. I have a niche passion for microbiology, specifically parasitology, and the case studies you presented will send me down a rabbit hole of textbooks and online searches as I try to confirm the answer. I hope I'm not too late to present my answer to last week's case study. For the following case study of a 50-year-old male presenting to the pharmacy with symptoms of abdominal discomfort, nausea, and bloating, later given mebendazole. Mebendazole can treat parasitic infections such as ascariasis, pinworms, hookworms, hydatid disease, and giardia. However, the patient vomited a non-segmented worm, so giardia is out. Hydatid disease or echinococcosis is a parasitic infection caused by tapeworm, a segmented worm, which is also out. Hookworms can travel to the gut from stepping on infected soil, but their total size can be 8 to 15 millimeters, depending on the worm's sex. These worms can travel to the lungs, mature, and be re-ingested, where living in the gut is probable. Similarly, pinworms are transmitted through the fecal-oral route and primarily live in the large intestine. Their size is roughly 6 to 13 millimeters. Both of these worms are too small when the case mentions the worm size was roughly 7 inches. This only leaves one left, and it is ascariasis. This parasite structure fits the description of pointy at one end and the worm's length. This parasite life cycle includes the individual consuming the eggs through unwashed fruits and veggies of contaminated soil. The eggs will hatch in the small intestine and travel to the lungs and heart through the bloodstream or lymph fluid. After maturing in the lungs for 10 to 14 days, they break into the airway, travel up the throat, coughed up, and re-ingested. Back in the gut, they mature and grow up to 40 centimeters or 11 inches. The females reproduce in the gut, and the whole cycle of egg ingestion to egg deposit is 2 to 3 months, and the adult worms can live in the gut for a year or two. This parasite is highly prevalent in India, where the patient is located. Based on how many worms the infected patient has in their gut, contributes to their symptoms of abdominal pain, bloating, and nausea. The laboratory I work for used to identify worms and other gut parasites a few years before I started working there. We no longer do that. Many specimens are preserved in jars to teach our CLS interns. Often, when it is a slow night, I like to bust out the old slides, teach myself what to look for, and practice the identification of oocysts or cysts. Thank you for all that you do and the education you provide. As we say in the lab, ooh, parasites, fun to look at, not to have. Courtney, an aspiring parasitologist.
All right.
Daniel.
Stefan writes, Dear TWiP team, greetings from cloudy, rainy, hilly, sunny Heidelberg with typical changing April weather and 6 degrees Celsius. The case description on morphology, no segment size, would be in line with Ascaris lumbricoides, and teasing the worm out or scaring it away with mebendazole out of the intestines via the oral end is a rare but reported event, as is ectopic location in the bile duct. Mebendazole would be the treatment of choice, and repeated treatment for multiple infection may be considered. Hope I'm in time this time with my response. Thanks for all your great work. Yours, Stefan.
Jason writes, Greetings, TWiP hosts. I'm writing to you from Kabale in Uganda, where it is 22 degrees C and raining and with intermittent power outages. Since I last wrote into TWiP, I've received a master's degree in infectious diseases from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and have just embarked upon the PhD in Health Professions Education Program at Widener University in Pennsylvania. Your various podcast offerings continue to fuel my academic studies, and I can't thank you enough for all of your efforts. In the TWiP 233 case of the regurgitated wriggler, the history is highly suggestive of infection with Ascaris lumbricoides, also known as the giant intestinal worm, roundworm. Oral exposure of a 7-inch nematode following the administration of mebendazole is virtually pathognomic for ascariasis. Warm regards, Jason. P.S. I have included 2 photos taken today at Uganda's Lake Bunyonyi with Dr. Despommier in mind. I recall from earlier episodes that he is an avid fisherman, and the crayfish and catfish shown here is offered as tribute to his Louisiana origins. You see that, Dixon?
Much appreciated. Absolutely. I read all these before, so yeah, absolutely.
But look at the crayfish, the
Wonderful.
catfish, and then he's got
different
TWiP.
kind of crayfish I'm looking at here. I'm not sure if these are land-based or water-based.
You know,
I don't know.
he's got TWiP
I
on
see
the
it.
phone
I
there.
see
You
it.
see?
No, it's terrific. Absolutely terrific.
All right.
We have a
And
global reach.
you're next, Dixon.
Hakon writes, I believe it's Hakon is the pronunciation. Hello again from balmy Athens. This week's case of a large, approximately 7-inch long worm in a man from India made me think of Ascaris lumbricoides. While I'm familiar with other large nematodes that infect people, Dioctophyma renale, Dioctophyma dracunculus medinensis, etc., none of these are typically treated with mebendazole, nor as ubiquitous as A. lumbricoides, especially in India. Without the worm in hand to look at, the law of averages is my muse. Thanks again for another episode. Hakon.
That's an interesting way to put it. The law of averages is my muse.
That sounds like a statistician.
All right. Well, Christina, all you have is one more.
Carol writes, I believe this is anisakaiasis, and Carol is an advocate for world peace.
All right.
All right. That'll do it. We have 3 additional guesses, right, Daniel?
We do. Vincent, you should go first here.
Well, the size of this worm and the fact that it's non-segmented, for me, said it was Ascaris. And then, well, many years ago, Dixon and I did an episode of TWiP where we talked about Ascaris.
Right.
And the image for that episode, so the name of it was TWiP 21, the giant intestinal worm Ascaris lumbricoides. The image was a picture of a huge bottle that he had taken in
Bangladesh.
Bangladesh.
This was at the University of Bangladesh in Dhaka.
And
this was
collected from one rural village in Bangladesh in a single day.
That's correct.
So they had given mebendazole to the people in the village. Is that right?
No, I think they give them piperazine.
Yeah,
piperazine actually paralyzes the worm,
Mm-hmm.
and they pass out while they're still alive. And I think mebendazole keeps them alive too. But
and they put them in probably formaldehyde for this
I
jar,
would
right?
think so. Or
there's thousands of worms in there. It's an amazing picture.
Thousands of worms in there.
Oh
That's right. Jar o' worms.
Jar of worms. So that's what I thought of also, Daniel, because they look a lot like this worm.
Yeah. Yeah, in our book, there's a picture. We haven't said yet if it's Ascaris, but maybe we have. But from a single girl, she ends up with piperazine, which sort of the advantage there is it would paralyze, and all these would just get flushed out, because normally they're swimming, like they're basically swimming against the flow in the GI tract. But this older medicine would paralyze them, and they would all just, within a matter of hours. And in the picture in our book, there's basically a tray just full of all the worms from this little girl who had just this very distended abdomen before. Yeah. But okay, Christina, is there any doubt? What are you thinking?
If you get this wrong.
No, I was very kind of with my usual tunnel vision. I thought this can only be Ascaris lumbricoides. I have to admit that this was the first thing that came to my mind. That's what I stuck with. And my colleague, Mike, has also got a jar of worms in his office, although probably not thousands. And actually, I'm not even sure if it's Ascaris or a big ginormous tapeworm, but, jars of worms everywhere. Yes, I'm going with Ascaris as well.
Good.
Dixon, you say good.
No. Listen, I have a certain weakness for worms because I worked on one which was quite small, but it's still a nematode for a low like 28 years or something like that in the lab, and I came to appreciate their versatility in terms of habitat occupation. And by the way, Daniel, I'd like to also suggest that in the old days when we used to give barium swallows to see what might be the cause of the blockage, when it was ascaris, the ascaris also swallowed the barium.
Oh,
So when the
wow.
barium had passed out of the patient, then they re-examined them, and you could see the outline of the worms quite beautifully with their gut tract filled with barium. So
That's cool.
the point I wanted to make, though, is that most of them assumed an S shape, right? So they would sort of press themselves against the wall of the small intestine in both directions to maintain their position in the gut. Because I don't know if they do. I don't know if they're that active, whether they could swim like say for strongyloides. Of course they can swim because we can watch them do that. But I'm not certain that
How
ascaris
much
does
they
a lot
pass
of.
down and swim back
Yeah,
up.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Exactly right. But I want to also mention something else, and that is that because they're so large, you can actually see their entire nervous system. And I know a lot of people who had worked on his nervous system. Forget whether it's a parasite or not. You can cut it down the middle, fold it out on a tray that's been filled with wax, pin the worm apart, and you can see all the commissures. You can see the main lines back to the brain, the nerve ring, which constitutes the brain of this seemingly simple organism that has a lot of ability to sense the environment from all of its nervous connections. And it can certainly know what to do when their environment changes. And one of the big changes in their environment happens to be temperature. When a kid develops a fever, let's say from malaria or from some other cause, the worm will migrate in an attempt to escape that heat. And sometimes you're lucky and they go out the anus, but other times you're not so lucky and they go up through the esophagus, or they penetrate into the ampulla of vata, or they go into the common duct, and lots of complications, unfortunately, for this one. And my pick, of course, is ascaris. I mean, I think it's a natural, and I love the worm. I think it's a very useful worm to study a lot of different things like sanitation, uh, population genetics as to who's susceptible and who's not. It's an easy worm to identify, and the eggs are prolific. They produce like 200,000 eggs every day. So you can imagine what a protein loss that is to a person that's marginally nutrition to begin with, to have to supply the worm with enough protein to make 200,000 eggs every day. That's per female. And this patient, I'm sure, had more than one. You rarely have just more than, you rarely have only one. You have many others. So I presume that the burden on each of these poor hosts to supply enough nutrition for both the host and the parasite weakens the host, not the parasite. Oh, and it also produces an anti. Am I covering ground that somebody else should be talking
No,
about?
this is great, Dixon. You keep going. I'm enjoying it. I'm sure everyone is enjoying this as much as I am.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Well, the last time I talked like this, you were my student. What do you expect? Actually, I did
I
teach
think the last time you talked like this, we were on a road trip down to ASTM&H in
Oh, we had a
Washington,
good
but
time.
keep going.
That was a great time. That was a great time. So, the ascaris worm also produces an antitrypsin factor, and it inhibits host digestive enzymes, which of course favors the survival of the protein long enough to be ingested by the parasite itself. So, a lot of interesting adaptations to its niche, and very, very, very successful parasite. 20% of an entire country that now has the largest number of people in the world is a remarkable statement to make about a worm that you can see and repulses people to the point of wanting them to quickly get rid of this thing. And yet, Christina so rightly pointed out that the contamination of vegetables and things like this, it gets into your food supply, and the next thing you know, you've got a worm.
Yeah, even eggs have been found on money, right? So
Yeah,
you handle
yeah,
money, and then you don't wash your hands, and maybe you
that's
pick
right.
up a piece of naan or something, and next thing you know, yeah.
Yeah, I learned that one from Peter Hotez, who said, you can even find these eggs on money. I said, oh my God.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, 200,000 eggs per day from like
200
per
for
female,
2 to
per
5
female.
years.
Yeah, they're just pumping them out. So
2 to
they're
5
all over
years.
the place. Yeah.
That's right.
That's the strategy. Put them
That is
everywhere.
just inundate the environment and let
Yep.
the host sort them out.
Well, that's what viruses do also. They make tons of
No,
offspring.
you're quite right. And by the way, that's very interesting. You should point that out, because let's imagine that the eggs are viral particles. Not all the
Mhm.
viral particles are produced identically. There are some mistakes in synthesis as well
Mm.
as interpretation of the genome, which results in defective virus particles. The same thing happens with Ascaris. The eggs are produced so prolific that the egg making machine inside the female sometimes makes a mistake. And you either don't get a fertilized egg, or you get an egg without a coating on it. You get
Mhm.
a lot of variations on a theme, so to speak. And you have to know about those variations if you're a microscopist and if you're looking. Now, do they have a NAT test for all of this?
So they do actually. Yeah, they
Okay.
do. Yeah.
So you can get the DNA signature of this parasite by simply looking at the feces, and that's perhaps the least invasive of any test I can possibly think of.
Yeah.
You want how much feces? I can give you more than that.
Yeah. You don't need very much for a NAT
You
test.
don't need very much.
Yeah.
No, but it's universal. Didn't have to be India. You could have picked virtually any country.
Yeah. And you don't even need a microscope in a case like this. I mean, when
No,
the
you don't.
worm
No,
is,
you don't. No, you don't.
this
Or-
large. So
We did have a case like this where the worm unfortunately crawled up out of the esophagus through the nasal passage
yeah,
out
they
the
tend to come
nose
up
of
out
this
the
small
nose
child.
rather than the mouth.
Mm.
Yeah.
And this happened at the Presbyterian Babies Hospital at Columbia Presbyterian
Yeah.
Medical Complex. And a third-year student was the only one that wasn't freaked out by it, because she had just recently had the course before she went on to her third year. And everybody else was huddled over on one side of the room. And they said, "What are we looking at this?" And she just, don't worry. And she just goes over to this poor little girl. She was about 8 years old. And I think she was from Uganda, in fact. And she, with gloved hands, of course, removed the worm, put it into a specimen jar, and walked it down to the laboratory. And when she got there, Gelpy was Mr. Gelpy was the parasitologist on call, and she said, "I have a present for you." And he said, "Well, you brought me something else. Oh, how nice!" Now, Christina, this is how people react when they like worms. And she opened this little specimen, and the worm was still moving, and they both knew what it was. So then, of course, they went back upstairs and they did a stool exam on virtually the entire family, and I don't know what the result of that was. I can't honestly say, but I would have presumed
I
they
would
were all
assume
infected.
everyone. Yeah.
Yeah,
Just so ubiquitous.
yeah, yeah.
So, Daniel, anything else to add here?
Oh,
No,
plenty.
no. I
There's
mean,
lots missing.
so
Come on.
yeah, Vincent put the link in just for our listeners to the TWiP 21, the giant intestinal worm episode, which is worth listening to. And I guess that's before the watching, so you'll just be listening. It'll be audio only, right?
That's right. Audio only.
Yeah, back in the old days. But yeah, this is. I mean, that's you basically see it, you recognize it. Yeah, this is Ascaris. So kudos to a lot of folks, and I guess maybe we can give away a book.
Yeah. Is there anything else about the patient you wanted to say, Daniel?
No.
That's it.
So I think a lot of what Dixon talked about is that someone does not have this degree of symptomatology unless they have lots of worms, right?
Right.
So yeah, a lot of these worms, are not going to be alive. They're going to die. They're going to be passed out in the feces. And sometimes when someone's as heavily infested, we might treat not with just a single dose, but we may actually do 3 days of treatment. And this has a huge impact, particularly on children, like the child that you see
Absolutely.
with that distended belly compared to, same age children will often be stunted as far as development. And yeah, this continues to be a huge problem throughout much of the world, really, impacting mostly children in a negative way. But there's sort of this interesting issue as we're seeing. It also can affect adults just as well. So,
Sure.
yeah.
You did not have any role in the care of this patient, right?
No, it was really just, it's sort of funny because the initial concern was like, what is this? Is that an earthworm? It's like, no, that's not an earthworm. That's really a
That's
parasite.
right.
And
That's right.
yeah, and this makes sense. And so it was more of my confirmation of everything. And then even some questions about, should certain parts of the population be dewormed on a regular basis? So sort of a discussion about when I was spending more time overseas. It was just really a question of how often I was probably being exposed to ascaris and these different things. And so, and so people at high risk, particularly children, in a lot of these endemic areas, there are scheduled deworming interventions.
Yeah, the sad part about this infection and malaria, if I could link the two together, is the fact that immunity is short-lived. And so therefore you don't have the virtue of having a single infection. It goes to completion, you got rid of it, and now you're good. Your immune system is intact and everybody's happy. That doesn't work for malaria, and it doesn't work for ascaris. It doesn't work for a lot of things
Yeah.
when you live in the tropics. Because, by the way, you are also partially immunocompromised by a lot of these infections. So your immune system isn't really up to the height that it could be if nothing else was there to fight off a single infection that you might encounter every now and then. You live with these as a background noise, so to speak, to the real problems of civil unrest and
Yeah, and
forced
and
migration
it's
and that
probably
sort of thing.
underappreciated. Like, so you mentioned Bangladesh,
Yeah.
which I've sort of traveled through, but not spent as much time as I would hope to be able to spend in the future. But in areas like that, there was a survey one time where they looked at adults, right? And we think, oh, it's mainly kids. You sort of grow
No,
out of
no,
this,
no,
but
no, no.
looking at adults and the amount that actually had biliary entry of ascaris, so the biliary ascariasis, it was actually quite high. It was like 10 to 20% in this ultrasound series. So, they're going all over the place in areas where it's endemic like this, and that can lead to not only obstruction of the biliary system,
Hmm.
but the bacteremia and the cholangitis that can come with that. Yeah, so it continues to
I
be
was
a
I
huge.
was often curious as to the relationship between episodic malaria, like seasonal malaria, and seasonal ascaris blockage of, and because ascaris responds to a high body temperature by trying to leave, and if 20% of the people at any one time have a problem with that, could there be a relationship between the organisms that generate a fever and the parasites that respond to it?
Yeah, and maybe there's, I mean, you wonder if there's a positive effect, right? Because ascaris does not like when you're having a fever, and it tries to flee. And
Exactly.
so when you're doing that, or the little kids when they're getting infected with malaria and getting the high fevers, the kids can end up with really high fevers. Are they going
Yeah,
to be passing more ascaris?
exactly. One more case comes to mind in this respect. They don't just migrate vertically, they can migrate horizontally. So as I mentioned, they're sort of assuming an S-shaped curve. So what they do is they actually puncture the wall of the small intestine and crawl out into the abdominal cavity. In the case that I'm familiar with, they were sent to the emergency room, diagnosed with acute appendicitis, was sent off to the OR. The physician opened the patient and made one remarkable observation in addition to the fact that the patient did not have an appendicitis attack. There was this unexplainable small, very round hole in the jejunal section of the small intestine, which of course was made by the parasite. They then said, no, no, she's got ascaris. And they went back and they actually reopened the patient and looked for the worm. They could not find it. It was very interesting. Nothing happened bad after that, but of course Then they treated her for the ulcers, of course. Lots of nuance to something that seems rather straightforward.
All right, let's give away a book.
You betcha.
We had 16 guesses.
That's a lot.
Well, we had more actually, but those other people have already won. So let's
Okay.
do a random number. It's number 9. Number 9. Just keep repeating it over and over. Number 9.
Number 9.
That is Christian from a surprisingly cold Basel.
Cool.
So, Christian, you have won a book. And what you have to do now is the following. You have to send an email to TWiP@microbe.tv. And in the subject line, you write, "I won a book." And tell us, well, in the body of the email, you can say what episode's 235. And all that helps to get it shipped out quickly, as opposed to when I used to do it, it was not shipped out quickly. Now, competent people are doing the shipping. And so email TWiP. I'm sorry, I even gave you the wrong email. It's incubator@microbe.tv. Okay, incubator@microbe.tv. Subject line, I want a book, and in the body say TWiP 235 Christian. And since you are in, what is it, a cold, what?
Basel.
Basel. We need your phone number for international shipping. Thank you very much and congratulations. All right. Next, we have a little hero from, I shouldn't say a little, a hero from Christina.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I have no information about his height, but
but his reputation was not little.
Yeah, so a hero and a half. I think you maybe see a bit of a theme, although I will divert from the theme going forward. So today I'm going to be talking about Ernst A.H. Friedheim. So the information that I'm presenting today is from a tribute to Ernst Friedheim that was published in 1979, so quite a long time ago. It was actually really difficult to find comprehensive information. So the past two heroes that I presented, there was really lots written about them, but there was really not very much written about Ernst Friedheim. And this is open access, so you can read it if you like. It is quite a gushing tribute. It's written by Clement Chesterman. It's named Dr. Ernst A.H. Friedheim and is published in the Transactions of the Royal Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene in 1979. And I've put a link in our show notes so that you can look it up. So Ernst Friedman, he was a fellow Swiss, just like I am. He was born a bit before me in 1899 in a beautiful city, Zurich, that I have actually visited often as a child because my grandparents lived there. So a beautiful place. There's not really much information about his early life, but he is noted to have had a modest school career, whatever that may mean. I suppose we can't really all excel as young people. But he did go on to study medicine at the University of Zurich, from where he graduated in 1924. And then he continued his studies and added to his portfolio of degrees a postgraduate diploma in microbiology awarded by the Pasteur Institute in Paris in 1926. Then he did a diploma in tropical medicine and hygiene in Hamburg in 1928. But he was not interested in a medical career, and he continued to study several disciplines, including pathology, kind of aspects of tissue culture and cell biology, spectroscopy, and finally physical chemistry and cell biology at the Rockefeller Institute in New York. And that was in 1931. So he spent quite some time studying. And then he moved back to Switzerland and he became an associate professor in the Faculty of Medicine in Geneva. He developed a strong interest in chemotherapy of parasitic diseases, and the tribute cites that this interest as having been triggered by a medical catastrophe in Cameroon in 1932, when actually 800 sleeping sickness patients, that's 800, were blinded by an overdose of atoxyl. So I think I just need to take a tiny detour really to talk about that drug before I go back to Ernst Friedheim. Atoxyl literally means non-poisonous, which is far from the truth. So this was an arsenic compound that had been synthesized in the 1860s, and it was shown to have or be an active compound against trypanosomiasis in 1905. But the drug was not very effective, and the doses required to be curative were so high that the toxic side effects outweighed the benefits. So atoxyl damaged the optic nerve, and treatment frequently caused blindness. So that was said to have triggered his interest in chemotherapy of parasitic diseases. So going back to our hero now. So he decided to prepare trypanosomal arsenicals, which could cross the blood-brain barrier, but without having an effect on the optic nerve or other parts of the brain. He did his work in his own kitchen, which he had converted to a laboratory. I'm not sure if he was married at the time, but if he was, I'm certain his wife would have probably not been very pleased having to, push away vials to cook her dinner. So while he did his chemistry synthesis in the kitchen, he did also animal work, and that was done at the University of Geneva. So he did at the same time actually study chemistry and then eventually completed a PhD in chemistry in 1939. So he was a busy man, that's for sure. His PhD thesis described a new class of trypanocidal arsenicals and their clinical evaluation, which was carried out in Nigeria under the auspices of the Colonial Office. I gather from the information that I have that he had originally found it difficult to find academic partners. And he himself, he wasn't willing to collaborate with industry. And I assume that made his work really quite difficult. He had, for example, reported on his findings of arsenical drugs to treat trypanosomiasis in 1936 in London, but he was then largely ignored. There were some misgivings about his work because I suppose, after all, his compounds were produced in his kitchen, and it was quite difficult to find partners to evaluate the drugs he had developed clinically. But as we know, he got there in the end. Friedman is actually a really unique in that sense that he did design the drugs, he synthesized the compounds in his kitchen, he evaluated them in the lab, then he undertook clinical field trials that helped establish treatment regimes. So I think that is really quite unique and unusual. So we all know how drug development happens these days, and it takes many people that are involved and many different disciplines, and it can take a long time. But he was really a one-man show, which I think was really rather interesting. So his main contribution was, I think, no doubt, was the development of melarsoprol, the drug that is used to treat late-stage trypanosomiasis. So it was introduced in 1949, and up to 1990, this was the only drug available to treat late-stage trypanosomiasis, both Trypanosoma brucei caused by Trypanosoma brucei rhodesiense and gambiense. Obviously, this drug has major limitations, as our esteemed TWiP listeners will know, including reactive encephalopathy in about 5 to 10% of treated patients. And it's also a very difficult drug to administer. Melarsoprol is insoluble in water and is dissolved in propylene glycol, and it has to be administered intravenously, and it induces really a severe localized inflammatory reaction. So not really a drug. So I did recently attend a tutorial by a colleague, Lucille Bloomberg, and she was kind of giving lots of case presentations of Eastern African trypanosomiasis. And what she often said, you really have to earn melarsoprol. We don't just give it. So not a great drug. But this is not the only work that Friedman is remembered for. So he wrote and published 130 papers on a succession of chemotherapeutic agents with activities against trypanosomiasis, schistosomiasis, onchocerciasis, other filarial infections, syphilis, and jaws. And he also worked on drugs for chelation therapy of mercury and lead poisoning. Another drug that was used clinically, another antimonial, stibocaptate, was used to treat schistosomiasis until better drugs were developed. So Friedheim, he was not really a recipient of great prizes or honors, but I think he really contributed much to a neglected field of medicine. So for the latter part of his careers, from 1945 to 1969, he had a lab at the Rockefeller University in New York. And then, he retired, I think, about around 1969 or thereabouts. But there isn't really much information about his later life, as there wasn't really much information about his early life either. I always kind of find it interesting what they do. But I don't really have that information. So that's another hero done.
Right.
And I was thinking, if anyone has any heroes you would like to be honored on TWiP, you could also send us an email.
Particularly if they're still living. It's always nice to celebrate someone who's, in the trenches as we speak.
TWiP at microbe.tv. Thank you, Christina. Daniel, can you read this email from Carrie?
Oh, certainly. Let me see here. Hello, Brain Trust. Well, off to a nice start. Flattery will get you everywhere. I don't know if this question should be sent to TWiV or TWiP. I'm a veterinarian working with helminth resistance to macrocyclic lactones. We should probably mention those are things like ivermectin or moxidectin. So using these drugs sparingly is essential to retard the onset of this calamity off course. However, in South Africa, there's a very large subset of inhabitants and human doctors still supporting the use of ivermectin as a treatment for COVID. The knock-on effect is that veterinary clients of mine wanting to prevent the Culicoides midge, the biting midge, transmitted African horse sickness virus are using this molecule prophylactically to supposedly kill this virus. As a veterinarian, I have been ultra interested in ivermectin and have enjoyed Wendy Zuckerman's podcast series, Science versus ... including one on the science behind ivermectin and SARS-CoV-2. Is there any science out there on any antiviral effects from ivermectin? I think an Australian lab showed some effect, but maybe at very high concentrations, much higher than is safe to give to humans. At least that's what one of the news channels put out during early stages of the COVID pandemic, and it is stuck in people's minds. I would love to hear a podcast on ivermectin and its position in medicine at present, but in the meantime, a short note would suffice to answer my concerns and underline the facts. As a vet, listening to your podcast often leads to information that can possibly have impact on veterinary disease management, for instance, Wolbachia, an adult Onchocerca cervicalis in horses. But hardly a podcast goes by without learning something from my human research colleagues. As Dixon says, it all adds to improvement of a One Health ecosystem, or something like this. Wish I was financially well off enough to be able to contribute to your patron support basis, as it is a super worthy cause if I ever knew one. May have to consider you in my will, but longevity is in my genome. Keep up the good work, as any of you guys would be great overnight dinner table guests if you ever visited hospitable Zimbabwe. It looks like Harare, Zimbabwe. Carl von Leeren. So thanks for that email. I probably we should mention a few things that, there was an article early in the pandemic that really, I have to say, very misleading title, right? It was like FDA approved medicine, ivermectin, shown to have antiviral effect, right? Almost suggesting that this is what it was approved for. And it really, as we saw in that case, it was super high doses. Not something that would be achievable. And it really led to this sort of downward spiral over time. And it's unfortunate to see that it just seems to be going on. And it's something we covered on the clinical update recently, is that there's ivermectin in a lot of national guidelines, particularly in some of these limited resource settings. Just, where when politics and science meet, you get politics.
My interest in this letter also extends to the culicoides part because I knew Lydia Blair. She was Dr. Campbell's assistant over at Merck, and she was charged with the task of finding out the broad range of susceptible organisms. Okay, so she actually showed that it was quite effective against ticks, against body lice, and I'm wondering if you had a high enough level of ivermectin in the blood of an animal, whether the culicoides, when they sucked up the blood, would have ingested enough ivermectin to kill it.
Hmm.
Not the virus, but the insect, the midge, biting midge, because it does interfere with their nervous system.
Yeah. I mean, scabies are
Uh,
a mite, so
yeah, that's right.
yeah.
And it has been suggested to use it for that, and I don't know if it's an approved therapy or not, but it is effective against animal scabies, by the way.
Yeah, I mean it's mange, right? That we're all familiar
Yeah,
with.
that's right.
So
That's right.
Yep.
yeah, it's one thing I would think for mites that are actually living, burrowing in, as opposed to a biting midge that's sort of
Yeah, yeah,
gone before. You're going to have much effect, and of course it's a concern, right? When you start overusing these medicines,
no question.
yeah, I mean it was a nice recent article. I'm trying to remember where the country was, but was they were looking at like, does ivermectin still work in scabies? Because boy, so much is being used. Still was 100% effective. I think it was a strongyloides paper actually. So we're still okay, but yeah, you always worry about if you, I think this is like the doctor situation, right, Vincent? Like it used to be an apple a day kept the doctor away, but now we're finding sometimes it takes 2 or 3. And so, yeah, even doctors are becoming resistant to apples. So, yeah,
Yes.
that's a joke, by the way, listeners. So
it's from one of our listeners wrote in that. Yes. All right, Daniel, do you have another case for us?
Yes. This is I hope a fun case, and I'm hoping that this case is as successful as the parasite is, in terms of generating lots of email responses, guesses. So I first learned about this case from a colleague at work. So I'm in the ICU, and one of my colleague tells me about their friends, or one of my medical colleagues. I've got this friend. He got really sick. And he says, this friend describes as over time having multiple illnesses. Even I think it was he even had COVID. But boy, he was never as sick as he just recently got. Of course, I'm curious. So we hear that this friend starts off with an illness that begins as a diffuse myalgia. So just all the muscles hurt. He goes on to develop fever. There's some sore throat. He notices some swelling in the lymph nodes in the neck, overwhelming fatigue. So what do we do when we're miserable? We vent to our friends. Oh, I feel so horrible. So he starts calling some of his friends, and they in turn say, oh man, me too. I feel really terrible. So it turns out that a number of his friends feel terrible. Say, what's going on? Where could we have gotten this? Now, it turns out that about a week prior to the onset of his symptoms, and actually a number of his friends who are sharing his misery, that they attended a large dinner where venison and boar was served. So this individual is then seen in our office. Some testing is done. He feels really terrible. He's actually assured by my colleague in the office that you're gonna be better. You don't really need to be treated. He is given a short course of treatment and does go on to make a recovery. So what are we worried about? What's going on here?
Wow. Now, Daniel, so this is he and some of his friends all feel badly, right?
There were a number of people at this large gathering, and about 24 of the people at the gathering end up getting sick. Now, I'm leaving out a few details for anonymity and protected health information, and even anonymity for the venue that hosted this large dinner.
Venison and boar. I mean, there's so many of them. I'm not even going to ask if they're AIDS positive or negative, HIV positive. It doesn't matter.
He was, this individual was, completely healthy, no significant past medical history, no significant comorbidities, a relatively younger individual, either side age of 30, just to give you kind of a ballpark there.
And this individual live alone?
Yeah, single lad.
And all these friends of his also live alone?
No. Some of them, it's a mixed match, and actually, there's kind of a range of age of individuals that attended this gathering.
Dixon, are you interested in this case?
Oh, more than mildly.
Yeah, I would say so.
Do you think this will be an incredibly successful case in getting email responses?
I think they can eliminate the impossible, eliminate the improbable, and they will be left with the truth, as it were.
Listen, there ain't no mosquitoes or flies involved. That's for
there
sure.
are a couple questions I'm hoping you guys will answer, or will add a couple of questions you'll ask, because otherwise I will volunteer. But one of the things that I thought was interesting, right? So venison and boar is served. So one of the questions, was, so everyone who got sick, did they eat both, or was there one of these two things that was sort of a common ingested thing?
Did everyone who got sick eat at least one of the two?
So everyone who got sick ate at least one of the two.
They were not strict vegetarians.
And it actually was, and I think this is interesting too. Everyone who got sick reported that they had eaten venison. It's not clear that everyone who got sick had boar.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
So
go ahead.
Were there people who ate one or the other and did not get sick?
Yeah. So interesting enough, the majority of people who attended this were just fine, had no issues. And I should point out that, this was the symptom complex, this diffuse myalgia, fever, sore throat, swelling in the neck, fatigue, all, about a week after. There was no diarrhea ever reported in any of the people attending this. That's a little bit of a hint, I think.
I have some questions, if you don't mind if I ask.
Yeah, go for it.
You did a number of tests. I'm not going to ask you which ones you did, and I'm not going to ask you if they all came back positive or negative. But did the one that come back positive allow you to say, don't worry about the rest of this, whatever this is, you'll get better and you'll feel better without treatment?
Yeah. So that
okay.
was
Okay.
Yeah.
So the positive test that came back that allowed you to say that.
Yep.
That's all I want.
Yep.
Daniel, do we know how the venison and the boar was prepared?
So I don't know how many of our listeners have eaten venison or boar, but it was prepared in a way where it was suggested that perhaps it could have been cooked a bit longer. So it was felt to be undercooked.
Okay.
Indeed.
All right, that'll do it. Now, you want to send in a guess? This is a different email, TWiP@microbe.tv. And we'd like you to put TWiP 235 in the subject line.
Good.
That will really help us. TWiP@microbe.tv, TWiP 235 in the subject line. If you want to read the case, you can find the show notes at microbe.tv/TWiP. And for any other correspondence, TWiP@microbe.tv. If you enjoy these programs, please consider supporting us. You can go to microbe.tv/contribute. Daniel Griffin, Columbia University Irving Medical Center, parasiteswithoutborders.com. Thank you, Daniel.
Oh, thank you. And everyone, be safe.
Dixon Despommier, trichinella.org, thelivingriver.org. Thank you, Dixon.
You're welcome, Vincent. Good stuff.
Christina Nall is at the University of Glasgow. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you, and have a good evening, everybody.
I guess bed is next for you, right?
It is, yeah.
Yes, it's, what is it now? Midnight, past midnight, right?
No, it's just about 11:30. I might go make myself a venison sandwich.
Cook it well. Cook it well.
Freeze it. Freeze it.
I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at microbe.tv. I'd like to thank the American Society for Microbiology for their support of TWiP and Ronald Jenkins for the music. Now, who's going to do the outro today?
I stepped on Christina's line last time, and I'm so sorry. It's her turn.
You've been forgiven.
All
right, so let's
I can
Christina.
sleep at night now.
It's all you, Christina.
You've been listening to This Week in Parasitism. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon.
Another TWiP is parasitic.
Genius. Absolute genius.